From gangsters in the 20s to cyber criminals today, we're picking the number one fugitive from every decade and seeing how the FBI finally caught them or didn't. Let's start in the 1920s, the era of prohibition, organized crime, and the birth of the celebrity criminal. And right at the top of the FBI's early hit list was Gerald Chapman. He wasn't just another gangster with a gun. Chapman was different. He carried himself like an aristocrat, well-spoken, cultured, and sharply dressed. The press nicknamed him the Gentleman Bandit and the Count of Gramercy Park because of the way he played the part of a high society intellectual while committing violent crimes on the side. But don't let the fancy exterior fool you. He was as dangerous as they come. Chapman's criminal career really took off in the aftermath of World War I, when he and his partner, George Dutch Anderson, started running bootlegging operations and planning heists. In 1921, they pulled off one of the most sensational robberies of the time, a $2.4 million mail truck heist in New York City, which is around $40 million today when adjusted for inflation. That robbery alone shook the U.S. Postal Service and prompted massive reforms in how federal shipments were protected. Chapman was arrested not long after and sent to Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, but he didn't stay there for long. In 1923, he pulled off a daring escape, which instantly elevated his status in the criminal underworld and made him a national figure. While on the run, he doubled down, robbing banks across the Northeast, orchestrating armed holdups, and eluding capture at every turn. But then things got darker. During a break-in at a home in New Britain, Connecticut, Chapman was confronted by a police officer. He didn't hesitate, he shot the officer dead, adding cold-blooded murder to his already serious rap sheet. That killing turned him from a glamorous thief into a high-priority target for federal law enforcement. The Bureau of Investigation, the early version of the FBI, made capturing Chapman a top priority. They poured resources into tracking him down, launching one of the largest manhunts of the decade. It took them almost 2 years, but they finally got him in 1925 in Muncie, Indiana. He went on trial for the murder of Officer James Skelly, and despite his expensive lawyers and attempts to charm the court, he was found guilty. In 1926, Gerald Chapman was hanged at the Connecticut State Prison, the first man executed in that state in nearly 20 years. What makes him stand out isn't just the crimes, it's the shift in tone his case brought to American law enforcement. Before Chapman, criminals were mostly seen as local problems. After Chapman, there was a growing sense that the federal government needed to step in and track these people down, across state lines, across regions, and across social classes. In a way, Gerald Chapman was the prototype. He helped define what a most wanted criminal looked like before the term even existed. He wasn't just one of the most hunted men of the 1920s. He helped shape the very reason the FBI exists in the form we know today. If you've ever watched a gangster film, you've probably heard the name John Dillinger. He wasn't just a bank robber, he was the bank robber. The face of crime in the 1930s, and the first person ever labeled public enemy number one by the FBI. Dillinger's criminal career started small, with a failed grocery store holdup that got him locked up in Indiana. But prison wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning. Because once he got inside, he met a group of hardened criminals. And when he got out, he formed a gang with them. A gang that would go on to rob more than a dozen banks across the Midwest, pulling off escape after escape, and somehow always staying one step ahead. What made Dillinger stand out wasn't just the robberies. It was how he did them. He was fast, clean, methodical, almost military in precision. He'd walk in, smile at the customers, and be gone before the police even showed up. At the time, there was no FBI as we know it today. Local police were outgunned and outplanned, and Dillinger made them look helpless. He escaped jail multiple times, including one legendary breakout using a fake wooden gun that he carved and painted black. Yes, that actually happened. But while the newspapers turned him into a kind of folk hero, the FBI wasn't laughing. Led by J. Edgar Hoover, the Bureau made Dillinger their number one target, a symbol of lawlessness they were determined to bring down. And in July of 1934, they got their chance. After months on the run, Dillinger was betrayed by a woman known as the Lady in Red, who tipped off the FBI about his whereabouts. They caught him outside the Biograph Theater in Chicago, and as he tried to run, agents opened fire, killing him on the spot. Crowds gathered around his body on the pavement. It was a national moment. Dillinger's death marked more than just the end of a manhunt. It marked a shift in American policing. The public saw the FBI as just a name before him. But after Dillinger, they saw it as a serious federal force, organized, armed, and ready to take on crime across state lines. He was charismatic, dangerous, and incredibly cunning, but in the end, even he couldn't outrun the machine he helped build. John Dillinger didn't just top the most wanted list, he helped create the reason it existed. Now, here's a name most people have never heard of, but in the early days of the FBI's most wanted list, Morley Vernon King was one of the first men in America they wanted off the streets. In 1947, King murdered his wife in cold blood during a domestic dispute. Then, instead of turning himself in, or even hiding quietly, he vanished. Left town, changed names, took jobs under false identities, and evaded law enforcement for years. By the time 1950 rolled around, the FBI was building its brand new 10 Most Wanted Fugitives list. And Morley King was one of the first names they put on it. That list was created to get the public involved in high-priority manhunts, and King's photo was plastered across post offices, newspapers, and radio bulletins nationwide. What made him such a priority wasn't just the crime, although murdering your wife is horrific enough, but the calculated, slippery way he managed to disappear. The Bureau feared that without national pressure, he'd just start over somewhere else, possibly remarry and repeat the cycle. It turns out that fear wasn't far off. After almost 4 years on the run, King was finally tracked down. On October 31st, 1951, King was arrested while shucking oysters in a restaurant in Philadelphia. Using the alias William Wilson, King had been working at the restaurant for several weeks, blending into everyday life. No weapons, no underground network, just a man who had become someone else entirely. He was arrested without incident, tried, and sentenced. And his case became a textbook example for why the 10 Most Wanted list was needed in the first place. Morley Vernon King may not be a household name today, but back then, he represented something new. He was part of a shift, from flashy bank robbers and bootleggers to quiet, calculated killers who could disappear into the crowd. And for the early FBI, he was proof that their new system of public alerts could actually work. He wasn't famous, but for the Bureau in the 1940s, he was one of the most dangerous men still out there. The 1950s marked the official start of the FBI 10 Most Wanted Fugitives list, and topping that very first lineup was Thomas James Holden. Literally number one, the first person ever placed on the list. Holden had a long criminal past, going all the way back to the 1930s, when he and his gang pulled off armed robberies across the Midwest. He even served time in Leavenworth Federal Prison, escaped, got caught again. The guy was no amateur. But the reason he made history as the FBI's most wanted man wasn't just his past. It was what happened in 1949. Holden had settled down, or at least that's what people thought, living in Chicago with his wife, her brother, and her stepbrother. Until one day, he snapped. During a violent argument, he pulled out a gun and shot all three of them dead, execution style. And then, just like that, he vanished. By the time the FBI launched the 10 Most Wanted list in March 1950, they were desperate to find him. Not only because of the triple murder, but because he had the history, the know-how, and the cold-bloodedness to stay gone for good. They plastered his photo in newspapers, post offices, police stations, across every state. And eventually that worked. He was recognized by a tipster in Beaverton, Oregon, working under an alias, living a quiet life like nothing had ever happened. He was arrested in 1951, tried and sentenced to life in prison. He died behind bars in 1953. Holden's case isn't just about the crime. Although 3 people lost their lives in a horrific act of violence, it's about why the FBI started its most wanted list in the first place. To make sure fugitives like him couldn't just slip through the cracks and restart their lives under a different name? He wasn't the flashiest criminal of the era, but as the very first face of the FBI's most public manhunt system, Thomas James Holden earns his place on this list without question. The 1960s were a decade of civil rights, unrest, and massive cultural change in America. And no case shook the country quite like the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the man who pulled the trigger, James Earl Ray. Ray was a drifter, a small-time criminal, and an escapee from the Missouri State Penitentiary. He had a long history of burglary and robbery, but nothing in his past hinted at what he'd do next. On April 4th, 1968, King was standing on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee, when a single shot rang out. That shot hit King in the jaw and severed his spine. He died less than an hour later. The news sent shockwaves across the world. And within hours, the FBI had launched a full-scale investigation, turning their attention to a fingerprint found on a rifle left near the scene. That fingerprint led them to James Earl Ray, who had used a fake identity to buy the weapon and flee the country. By the time the FBI confirmed his identity, Ray had already made it to London, using a series of aliases and forged passports. He was officially added to the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list on April 17, 1968, just 13 days after the shooting. What followed was one of the most high-pressure international manhunts in FBI history. Ray was finally caught at Heathrow Airport, trying to board a flight to Brussels with a Canadian passport in someone else's name. He was extradited to the US and charged with King's murder. Now here's the strange part. Ray pleaded guilty to avoid the death penalty. But just 3 days later, he tried to withdraw that plea, claiming he was part of a larger conspiracy. He would go on to change his story many times over the years, fueling theories that others may have been involved. But whether he acted alone or not, Ray became the face of one of the darkest days in American history. He died in prison in 1998, still insisting he wasn't the one who pulled the trigger. Some people believe him, most don't. What's certain is that for the FBI in the 1960s, James Earl Ray was the most hunted man in the country, and his capture marked one of the most visible and politically charged moments in the entire history of the 10 Most Wanted list. There's a good chance you've already heard the name Ted Bundy. He's become one of the most infamous serial killers in modern history, and in the 1970s, he was the FBI's worst nightmare. Bundy didn't look like a serial killer. He was clean-cut, charming, articulate, and that's what made him so dangerous, because behind all that was someone who methodically abducted, assaulted, and murdered dozens of young women across multiple U.S. states. His crimes began in the late 1960s, but it was the early to mid-70s when things escalated. College campuses, parking lots, nighttime streets. Bundy stalked these places like a predator. He'd fake an injury or ask for help, then lure his victims to a secluded area. And that's where the violence began. Bundy's killing sprees stretched across Washington, Oregon, Utah, Colorado, and finally Florida. What's terrifying is how many people miss the signs. He was studying law, working on a political campaign. He even escaped from custody twice, once by jumping out of a courthouse window, and later by cutting a hole in the ceiling of his jail cell. It wasn't until 1977, after his second escape and a series of horrific murders in Florida, including the Chi Omega sorority house killings, that the FBI placed him on their 10 Most Wanted list. And even then, it took a stroke of luck to bring him in. Bundy was finally stopped in February 1978, when a routine traffic stop in Pensacola led to his arrest. He gave a fake name, but the officer noticed stolen plates and followed up. And just like that, the FBI had him. What followed was one of the most high-profile trials of the decade. Bundy insisted on representing himself in court and turned the whole thing into a media spectacle. But despite all the showmanship, the evidence was overwhelming. He was convicted, sentenced to death, and after a long appeals process, executed by electric chair in 1989. Outside the prison, a crowd cheered and lit fireworks. Ted Bundy wasn't just a killer. He was a manipulator, a showman, and a case study in how charm can hide cruelty. And for the FBI in the 1970s, he wasn't just a fugitive. He was a face they needed off the street at any cost. The 1980s were filled with high-profile crimes, from cartel violence to political scandals. But when it came to the FBI's most wanted list, Victor Manuel Garina stood out for one reason. He pulled off the largest cash heist in U.S. history at the time, and then vanished. On September 12, 1983, Garina, who worked as a security guard for a Wells Fargo depot in Connecticut, carried out an inside job that stunned federal investigators. He tied up two of his coworkers, injected them with an unknown substance to disable them, and walked out with $7 million in cash. That's about $20 million today. But this wasn't just about money. Garina wasn't your typical thief. He had political motivations. Authorities later linked him to a Puerto Rican separatist group called Los Macheteros, who opposed U.S. presence on the island and were allegedly supported by Cuba. In other words, this heist wasn't just a robbery, it was an act of political resistance, and possibly even an international operation. The FBI quickly added him to the 10 most wanted list in May 1984 and launched a massive manhunt. They believed Garina had been smuggled out of the country, possibly to Cuba, where he would be out of reach of U.S. law enforcement. For years, his face appeared on wanted posters, TV shows, and news segments, and yet he was never found. He became one of the longest-standing fugitives in FBI history, spending over 32 years on the list before finally being removed in 2016. Not because they caught him, but because he'd been missing for so long, he was no longer considered an active threat. To this day, Victor Garina is still technically at large. Some believe he's alive and well, living under government protection. Others think he may have died in exile quietly and anonymously. But in the 1980s, he represented something far bigger than just a thief on the run. He was a symbol of political defiance and a major embarrassment to the FBI. For them, Garina wasn't just a fugitive, he was a ghost. When it comes to organized crime, few names carry the kind of weight that Whitey Bulger does. In the 1990s, he wasn't just a mobster on the run. He was the face of one of the FBI's biggest failures, and one of the most powerful crime lords the U.S. had ever seen. Bulger ran the Winter Hill Gang in Boston, and for 2 decades, he controlled everything from extortion to drug trafficking to murder, all while secretly working as an FBI informant. That's the twist. While he was building an empire of violence on the streets, he was also feeding information to the FBI, using his position to take down his rivals and protect himself from prosecution. But eventually, the whole thing came crashing down. By 1995, indictments were closing in, and just days before he was supposed to be arrested, Bulger disappeared. Turns out he'd been tipped off by his own FBI handler, a longtime friend and corrupt agent named John Connolly. The scandal that followed was massive. The FBI had essentially helped protect a man responsible for at least 19 murders. Some carried out personally, others ordered. They added Bulger to the 10 most wanted list in 1999 and put out a reward of $2 million, second only to Osama bin Laden at the time. For years, the trail went cold. People speculated he was in Europe, Asia, South America, but in 2011, after 16 years on the run, a tip came in from someone who had seen a quiet couple living in Santa Monica, California. It was Whitey, living under the name Charlie Gasco with his longtime girlfriend. The FBI raided the apartment, and there he was. Older, quieter, but still unmistakably Whitey Bulger. He was tried in 2013, convicted on 31 counts including racketeering, conspiracy, and multiple murders, and sentenced to 2 life terms plus 5 years. And in 2018, just hours after being transferred to a new prison, he was beaten to death by fellow inmates. Whitey's story isn't just a gangster movie come to life. It's a deep stain on the FBI's history, a case that blurred the line between law enforcement and organized crime. And in the 1990s, his betrayal and disappearance made him one of the most wanted and most embarrassing fugitives the Bureau had ever faced. Out of everyone we've covered so far, this is arguably the most hunted man ever on the FBI's list. Osama bin Laden. While previous fugitives were hiding from bank robberies, murder charges, or gang ties, bin Laden was the mastermind behind one of the deadliest terrorist attacks in world history. But what some people forget is he was already on the FBI's radar before 9/11. In 1998, the U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania were bombed, killing over 200 people. The attacks were traced back to bin Laden and his terrorist network, Al-Qaeda. And that's when the FBI added him to the 10 most wanted fugitives list in 1999, offering a $5 million reward. But then came September 11th, 2001. 19 men, trained and directed by Al-Qaeda, hijacked 4 commercial planes. 2 hit the World Trade Center, 1 crashed into the Pentagon, and the last went down in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, after passengers fought back. Nearly 3,000 people died that day, and just like that, Osama bin Laden went from a wanted fugitive to public enemy number 1. The FBI upped the reward to $25 million, and later $50 million, as the CIA and military launched a global manhunt. What followed was nearly a decade-long pursuit. Bin Laden moved from cave systems in Afghanistan to safe houses in Pakistan. The trail went cold, and for years there were no confirmed sightings, just audio tapes and threats. The world changed during that time. Wars were launched, governments toppled, and the FBI, along with nearly every branch of U.S. intelligence, was dedicated to finding him. Finally, in May 2011, after years of intelligence gathering, SEAL Team 6 raided a compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan. They found him on the 3rd floor, and after a brief firefight, he was shot and killed. His body was buried at sea. And the news of his death triggered reactions around the world. Relief, closure, even celebration. Unlike many fugitives who lived in the shadows for money, revenge, or survival, bin Laden operated on a global scale, with ideology at the center of everything he did. And in the 2000s, no one was more feared, more searched for, or more discussed than him. His placement on the FBI's list wasn't just symbolic. It represented a shift in how the world saw terrorism, justice, and the reach of law enforcement. Bin Laden wasn't just a fugitive. He was a new kind of enemy, and finding him became a mission that shaped a generation. Most of the criminals on this list were already infamous by the time they landed on the FBI's radar. But Rafael Caro Quintero was different. He was a name from the past, the narco of narcos, who somehow became one of the most hunted fugitives of the 2010s. Caro Quintero co-founded the Guadalajara cartel back in the 1980s. He played a central role in Mexico's early drug empire, moving massive quantities of cocaine and marijuana into the U.S. But what really set things off was the 1985 kidnapping, torture, and murder of DEA agent Kiki Camarena. That case changed everything. The U.S., especially the DEA, took it personally. Caro Quintero was arrested in Mexico and sentenced to 40 years. But here's the twist. In 2013, a Mexican court released him early on a technicality. By the time the decision was reversed, he was gone. In 2018, the FBI added him to the 10 most wanted list. Reward? $20 million, one of the highest in the list's history. More than Whitey Bulger, even more than El Chapo. They believed he was back in cartel operations, protected by armed guards, corrupt officials, and a reputation that still carried weight. For years, he was rumored to be hiding deep in the Mexican mountains, constantly moving between remote safe houses. Then, in 2022, Mexican Marines finally caught him. But even that came with a cost. The helicopter carrying part of the arrest team crashed, killing 14 officers. Today, he's back in prison, awaiting extradition to the U.S. Caro Quintero's story is long, brutal, and still unfolding. But in the 2010s, even decades after his original arrest, he proved that the FBI never stops watching. And now, we've reached the final case on our list, and this one's a little different. For starters, she's the only woman on the FBI's current 10 most wanted list. And unlike most of the fugitives we've talked about, she still hasn't been caught. Her name is Ruja Ignatova, but she's more widely known as the Crypto Queen. Ruja was a German-Bulgarian entrepreneur who launched OneCoin in 2014. a so-called cryptocurrency that promised to rival Bitcoin and make investors rich beyond their dreams. She sold it with flair, ballrooms, stage lights, elegant dresses, TED Talk-style presentations. But behind the buzz and branding was a massive Ponzi scheme. OneCoin wasn't based on blockchain. It wasn't even real. What she was selling was air, and convincing millions of people around the world to invest their life savings in it. By the time it all collapsed, OneCoin had defrauded investors of over $4 billion globally. Whole communities were wiped out financially. People lost homes, retirements, even family members cut over the scam. In 2017, just days before she was due to be arrested, Ruja vanished. Some say she boarded a plane to Greece. Others believe she changed her appearance through plastic surgery, or that she's being protected by organized crime groups. There are even theories that she's dead, but the FBI isn't buying it. In 2022, they officially added her to the 10 most wanted list, offering a reward of $100,000 for information leading to her capture. Now, you might be wondering, her crimes happened in the 2010s, right? True. But the FBI didn't place her on the most wanted list until the 2020s. So that's the decade we're placing her in here. And honestly, it fits. Because Ruja represents a new type of criminal, one who operates not through violence, but through manipulation, psychology, and digital deception. No guns, no getaway cars, just a global audience. And a web of lies. As it stands today, Ruja Ignatova remains one of the most elusive fugitives in the world. And unlike many of the names we've covered in this video, her story isn't over yet. That's one most wanted fugitive for every decade. Some got caught, some vanished. Maybe you've got a name you think should have made the list. Let me know if you think I missed any. Either way, there's plenty more to come. See ya.